Okay, welcome everyone to the Minnesota Loon Restoration Project on the Moss program for today. And we have a very special guest, Jayden Jech, loon specialist and project lead for the Minnesota DNR. Go ahead and tell the folks a little bit about yourself, Jayden.
Yeah. So thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here today. Like Craig said, my name is Jayden. I'm a loon specialist and I'm the project lead for the Minnesota Loon Restoration Project here at the Minnesota DNR. With a couple of years of loon experience in New Hampshire and some other conservation work, I'm happy to be back in my home state studying our state bird. So I'm happy to be here and talk a little bit about the work that we're doing and share some loon information with you all.
Very good. Okay, you go ahead and take your presentation away. I'm going to close down my video and the show is all yours.
Great. Well, thanks again. And I'm again very excited to be here with everyone to talk about possibly Minnesota's favorite bird, but our state bird, and some of the restoration and conservation work that we're doing here in Minnesota to support this iconic species. So today I'm going to be talking about restoring Minnesota state bird and diving into a little bit more information about the Minnesota Loon Restoration Project. And I just like to begin by saying that the work that we're doing as part of the Loon Restoration Project is part of a project called Restoration of Common Loons in Minnesota. It's funded by the Open Ocean Trustee Implementation Group through the Natural Resource Damage Assessment from the Deepwater Horizon Settlement. So here I am. As part of the Loon Restoration Project, we're housed in the non-game wildlife program here at the DNR. The non-game wildlife program is focused on supporting conservation of all non-game wildlife species, which includes loons. Other species could be blandings turtles, trumpeter swans, and other species that call Minnesota home. So we're happy to be working alongside non-game wildlife program staff in supporting efforts for the conservation of our common loon here with the Minnesota Loon Restoration Project. So a little bit of an overview for what we're going to be covering today. We're going to talk a little bit about an introduction to common loons and dive into some of the information that we have about them and learn some maybe new fun facts that you didn't know before about some birds that you may have recognized on Minnesota lakes. We'll dive into the details about the Minnesota Loon Restoration Project and the work that we're doing with partners. And we're also going to talk about being loon aware on Minnesota lakes this holiday weekend. We're always loon aware when we're enjoying Minnesota's freshwater lakes, but some extra precautions that we're looking forward to sharing with you all about keeping loons safe this weekend and beyond. And then we're going to have quite a bit of time for some questions and answers where you'll get to ask those questions that you've been wondering about loons for a long time, and I'll do my best to answer those. So I'm looking forward to getting started. So the common loon is one of 5 species of loons. In Minnesota, we only have the common loon with some occasional visitors. So the common loon is the most common species of loon. There's also the red-throated loon, yellow-billed loon, Pacific loon, Arctic loon, and red-throated loon. I believe I got all 5 of them there. All of these birds, these loons, occur in Alaska and other parts of North America. But in Minnesota, we're just home to the common loon, otherwise known as Gavia immer. It's been Minnesota's state bird since 1961 and has been a symbol for Minnesota since and likely even before. You may recognize loon murals, paintings, and mailboxes on your way up north, and loons here are just a true sign of Minnesota and northern Minnesota as well, as they occupy lakes in the northern part of the state. It's a diving water bird, and loons are specially adapted to be on the water. So they spend almost all of their time on the water, whether that be freshwater here in Minnesota or even saltwater when they make their migration down to the Gulf of Mexico or southern Atlantic coast, which we'll dive into a little bit. Loons have dense bones, which allow them to dive at great depths, loons can dive at depths greater than 200 feet to catch fish at all different levels of the water. And it also requires them to have quite an extensive runway before taking off. So if you've ever seen a loon take off from a Minnesota lake, you may have seen them run across the surface like an airplane. They need a little bit of speed and momentum by running across the water before they're able to take flight. So these bones have them weighing upwards of 10 pounds at times. And so these birds are quite unique compared to other birds that we have in Minnesota. In Minnesota, we recognize them with their beautiful checkered plumage that they have in the state. But as fall approaches and migration season approaches, you may recognize them a little bit different. Their checkered pattern goes away and they turn into a more dull gray color. And this is the color that juvenile loons will have for the first couple of years. And it's also the color plumage that they'll have when they're on the ocean in their non-breeding range. So we were talking a little bit about range of common loon here. And in Minnesota, this includes the coniferous forest biome in the northern part of the state. But we also see loons into the central part of the state as well as into the metro. So loons have quite an extensive range here in the state of Minnesota. And they can also be found in other parts of the northern lower part of the United States, includes Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, New York, and even parts of Montana and Washington. The common loon range, the breeding range is pretty wide for the northern part of the United States. Like I said earlier, there's a large population of loons in Alaska, and they are home to the greatest number of common loons in the United States. When they're not here in Minnesota or in their breeding range, they make a big migration down to the Gulf of Mexico. Most of Minnesota loons will make their way to the Gulf of Mexico. Some others will make their way to the southern Atlantic coast of the United States. But these loons spend quite a bit of time on the ocean. And that's something we don't always think about when we see loons here in Minnesota. So they're specially adapted to thrive in not only Minnesota, but also the oceans that border the United States as well. Alaska also has a very extensive breeding population of common loons. And so it's pretty neat to see how Minnesota is on their southern part of their range, but still includes quite a few loons. And Minnesota is home to a number of loons because of our wonderful lakes, land of 10,000 lakes. These lakes support common loon habitat. Loons prefer clear and very deep lakes, which support the diverse fish population that they rely on. Abundant forest fish, such as cisco, are extremely important in supporting loons, especially during fall migration. They prefer irregular shorelines with islands and bays. Bays often have quite a bit of protection from waves and are an ideal spot for loons to have nests. In addition, islands can help deter some mammalian predators and often have great coverage to camouflage a loon nesting location. All of these locations might be hard to find because loons prefer nesting locations that are protected and may be difficult to see by humans, so that they're blending in with their natural environment to try to protect them as much as possible from some of the natural predators on Minnesota lakes. So one of my favorite parts about the loon is the unique calls that they have. So I'm going to talk about the 4 calls that scientists know and what we can understand about those calls. So I'll talk about each one individually and I'll play them here as well. So we first have the tremolo, which is a distress call. You may hear the tremolo as they're flying overhead, or you might even hear this at night. Oftentimes you may hear the tremolo call if you see a large group of loons as well. So I'll play that here. I'll play it again. So this tremolo call is one that I kind of recognize most often. It can be seen kind of as a laughter, but it's not funny for loons. This is a sign of distress. If you hear a tremolo call when you're observing loons, it may mean that you're a little too close and that you should paddle away or boat away to prevent any further distress to loons. But they'll often use this call between other loons as well. We also have the wail, which you might hear at night. This call is used during interactions among loons, and it's often to regain contact with a mate or other loon on the lake. So I'll play that call. Here is the wail. I'll play that again for everyone. Again, I always think of this one and hear this call, thinking about a campfire on the shore or near a lake. And so it's always a fun call to hear from the loons. We also have the yodel, which is one of the most unique calls that loons make. And the yodel is a call made only by males. And this is typically used in a territorial defense. You may also hear a yodel from an interaction with an avian predator as well. And I'll play that one more time for everyone. Again, a distress call typically used in territorial defenses. But if you hear this call, you know that that loon is a male loon because, again, only male loons make that call. And then my personal favorite is the hoot. The hoot is primarily used between pair members and chicks, and it is often used for short-range communication. I'll play that again. This call may be more difficult to hear because they're using it for short-term communication or short-range communication, and it only happens a little bit, so it's more difficult to hear. There were some more loon calls. So a little bit more information about Minnesota's common loon population. Our monitoring data from the Minnesota DNR has suggests that our populations are mostly stable. In recent years, including 2023, we've started to begin seeing slight declines in juvenile loon abundance. And so this is just a testament to how important conservation and restoration efforts are in the state of Minnesota. And this monitoring data would not be possible without the help of hundreds of community scientists across the state contributing to our community science programs. So this includes the volunteer Loon Watcher Survey, and our population estimates are supported by our Minnesota Loon Monitoring Program. Minnesota's loon population is estimated to be about 12,000 adults, so just over our 10,000 lakes that we're home to. And in Minnesota, we recognize the species as a species of greatest conservation need. So this means that we're working hard here at the state, and community partners across the state are also working to support the conservation of the species, as we recognize the importance that it has for our freshwater ecosystems, and also for our own interest here in Minnesota of watching loons on Minnesota lakes. And there's a number of potential threats that loons face here in Minnesota and even beyond. So shoreline development is a potential threat to common loons here in the state. As humans continue to develop around shoreline areas, oftentimes natural shoreline areas may be altered or eliminated from lakeshore habitats. Once this lakeshore habitat has been eliminated, there are less locations on a lake for loons to nest. And loons are not able to nest on developed shorelines such as riprap here. And so as development happens across lakes, our loon nesting habitat begins to move smaller and smaller and smaller. Water quality declines are also a potential threat to common loons here in Minnesota. Loons are visual predators, and like I said earlier, rely on a very clear and deep lakes to support fishing, which ultimately is important for rearing young loon chicks on Minnesota lakes. So potential declines of water quality from various forms of pollution are a threat to common loons. Lead and contaminants. So lead fishing tackle is a documented cause of mortality for loons here in the state of Minnesota. And other contaminants have been documented in loons across their breeding range. And so these are both potential threats to common loons here in the state of Minnesota. And we're working with our partners at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, Get the Lead Out program, as you can see pictured here, is a lead tackle drop box collection. Human disturbances. So as humans recreate on Minnesota lakes, there are some instances where we may be interacting with loons as well, especially during their nesting phase. And so potential human disturbance such as boat wake may cause flooding of loon nesting areas or startle loons off nest if approached too quickly. So we like to remind folks to help protect our state bird by not approaching loon nests, not approaching loon families, and reminding folks that loons are protected species and are protected under both state and federal laws. And disasters and disease outbreaks are potential threats to loons. Highly pathogenic avian influenza is a disease that scientists are continuing to keep a close eye on and monitor the potential effects that they may have on common loons, as well as other potential disease outbreaks that are found in wild water birds. And disasters such as oil spills, which leads me to our next point, are potential threats to common loons as well. So that's a little bit of background about Minnesota state bird. And now we're going to dive into talking a little bit more about Minnesota Loon Restoration Project and the work that we're doing in Minnesota to support the conservation and restoration of our state bird. So some of you may remember the 2010 Deepwater Horizons oil spill that happened in the Gulf of Mexico. This occurred when a drilling unit exploded and released extensive amounts of oil. And this oil caused loss of wildlife and natural resource injury and potentially affected a number of Minnesota loons. It's estimated that several hundred loons may have been impacted by this specific oil spill. And so through previous research that was occurring in Minnesota with the Minnesota DNR Non-Game Wildlife Program and partners at federal agencies such as the U.S. Geological Survey, the state of Minnesota and our partners were able to secure over $4.8 million. And the DNR Non-Game Wildlife Program has been working to implement the Minnesota Loon Restoration Project to restore loons that were impacted by this oil spill. The goal of our Loon Restoration Project is to reduce mortality and increase reproductive success of common loons in Minnesota. And to do so, we're working with a number of partners. This includes the U.S. Geological Survey, which is the federal agency responsible for a lot of bird research here in the United States. We're also working with partners at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Department of Interior to implement our project. And we have a state partner at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency who's leading the Get the Lead Out program and sharing essential information about impacts of lead fishing tackle on common loons and other wildlife here in the state of Minnesota. In order to implement this project, we're working on two primary strategies. This is the acquisition of lakeshore loon habitat, as well as engaging the public and enhancing loon productivity with artificial nesting platforms across the state. So the Minnesota Loon Restoration Project is focused in 8 counties. This is our 8-county focal area. This area was selected because it has high potential to sustain quality loon habitat here in Minnesota. And we were confident that conservation efforts in this area will make a difference. And so these 8 counties include Beltrami County, Clearwater, Becker, Itasca, Hubbard, Cass, Crow Wing, and Aiken counties. And since our project started and in recent years, we've expanded a number of our outreach efforts and conservation efforts to include lakes outside of this 8-county focal area, but most of the work that we're doing is focused in this area. And so through these strategies, we are working on 4 primary objectives. We're acquiring loon habitat, augmenting natural nesting locations with artificial nesting platforms. And from here, I'll call them ANPs for short. We are promoting loon-friendly stewardship with lake associations and community partners across the state. And we're also working to monitor loons and project implementation with the help of our partners at the Department of Interior. And so our first objective is to acquire loon nesting habitat. This is the primary objective of the Minnesota Loon Restoration Project. And you're probably wondering, Jayden, why are we so focused on acquiring loon habitat? And that's because natural habitat, or this undisturbed natural lakeshore habitat, is so essential for continuing to conserve loons for years to come. Loons rely on natural shoreline areas for nesting, rearing their chicks, and migration staging. These natural shoreline areas support overall ecosystem health and are important in maintaining our presence of loons in Minnesota for years to come. And so this is our primary objective. Our goal is, once acquired, to turn these acquired land parcels into public lands for management. So this is either through aquatic management area or wildlife management area. And once acquired, these lands will be open to the public and also be an essential locations for supporting loons nesting across the north central part of the state of Minnesota. So as you can see in this photo, you can see some of the natural shoreline area and how the loons are close, likely fishing nearby. In locations where we're not able to protect permanent natural shoreline areas, or locations on lakes that have extensive development, we're looking to augment natural nesting in targeted locations with community partners. So we've partnered with dozens of lake associations across the state of Minnesota to deploy artificial nesting platforms to support loon nesting habitat in those areas where there is no longer suitable natural shoreline areas. And so these artificial nesting platforms can be used as an important management tool when they're selected and targeted locations. So when they're used as a management tool, includes locations with high levels of water level fluctuation, in areas where there may be limited suitable habitat available, in addition to areas that may see reoccurring predation, either from avian and mammalian predators. But artificial nesting platforms can also cause potential problems. Research from scientists across North America have indicated that deployment of artificial nesting platforms in some locations may also cause problems for loons. If not properly constructed, these platforms can also become a hazard for loons nesting on them as well. And so working with conservation organizations in the DNR to support selecting the correct location and targeted locations is extremely important in the success of these platforms, because we're not hoping to cause any problems for loons when we're looking to conserve them into the future. I also like to point out that artificial nesting platforms aren't always permanent solutions, which is why shoreline restoration and acquisition of natural shoreline habitat is so important in continuing to protect loons for many years to come. We're also working to increase lake stewardship and education across the state. We have a loon-friendly lake registry, which has over 50 lake associations that are a part of our ongoing efforts to share loon conservation information. And so that includes lake associations and a number of community partners as well. We work with lake associations to develop lake management plans, which focus on the best way to conserve loons on each specific lake across the north central part of the state. So we're looking to document history of loons on the lake, consider what changes may have occurred to the lake in the past and into the future. We look at potential barriers to loon productivity, such as limited shoreline habitat availability or water quality concerns as well. And then we recommend voluntary actions to improve lake and loon conditions on those lakes. A big part of our lake stewardship and education has been partnering to get the lead out of Minnesota lakes with our partners at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency. So like I said earlier, lead fishing tackle is a known cause of loon mortality here in Minnesota. And loons are ingesting lead in several different ways. Sometimes loons will pick up small rocks off the bottom of the lake to aid in digestion. And sometimes if a small lead sinker is at the bottom, it can be hard for a loon to decipher which is a pebble and which is a piece of lead. And so sometimes loons will ingest small pieces of lead off the bottom of the lake. Additionally, loons may try to take lead lures directly off the line or eat fish that have a lead tackle attached in some way. According to the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, approximately 25% of adult common loon deaths are related to lead fishing tackle. And so we're working with the Pollution Control Agency as well as the dozens of community partners that I mentioned before to reduce loon exposure to lead fishing tackle. Our partners at MPCA are able to highlight lead-free alternatives and provide additional information about reducing loon exposure to lead-based fishing tackle. And then one of my favorite parts of the job is going out on Minnesota lakes and monitoring loons on our lakes. And so we're partnering with our partners with the Department of Interior and U.S. Geological Survey to implement loon productivity monitoring. So we're trying to understand the occupancy of territories. Loons are extremely territorial, so better understanding occupancy is really important in our research efforts. Nest searching and building that may be occurring across Minnesota lakes in our 8-county focal area, as well as better understanding loon nesting times, loon nesting failures, whether that be from natural causes or from human-based causes. And then we're also looking to understand how many loons are hatching on different lakes and what lakes or what loons are then migrating down to the Gulf of Mexico in the fall. So there's a number of different factors that we're looking at when monitoring loons, and it would not be possible without the work of our partners as well. I'd also like to point out that the Minnesota DNR non-game wildlife program has a number of community science opportunities for folks to become involved in community science. And 2 of those projects involve loon monitoring. So one is the Minnesota Loon Monitoring Program, which is happening right now. Folks are out across the state monitoring loons to better understand our loon population. And then we also have the Volunteer Loon Watcher Survey. And if you're interested in finding out more information about both of these community science opportunities, please be sure to visit our website or contact me. My contact information will be at the end of this presentation if you have any questions regarding our community science opportunities for you to become part of the monitoring as well. If you're interested in participating with the Loon Restoration Project, please let us know. We have opportunities to join our Loon Friendly Lake Registry. We primarily work with lake associations, but we're open to working with folks from across the state with different types of experiences and backgrounds to implement loon-friendly activities in our focal area and beyond. We also would encourage you to speak with program staff or other loon conservation organizations to determine whether an artificial nesting platform or ANP may be suitable at your lake. This way, we're able to talk about some of the factors that we consider when deploying artificial nesting platform. We'll also provide essential information to you of what's required for artificial nesting platforms. In the state of Minnesota, artificial nesting platforms typically will require a permit from your local county sheriff's office. So it's important that you connect with either some loon conservation organization, the DNR, or your county sheriff's office to better understand what may be required when deploying an artificial nesting platform here in Minnesota. We'd also encourage you to collaborate with their partners at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency's Get the Let Out program to learn more about how you can become involved with their efforts. And then we'd also encourage you to participate in some of our community science opportunities that we have here at the Minnesota DNR non-game wildlife program. And so that's a little bit of a recap about the Minnesota Loon Restoration Project. We're working with a number of community partners, state partners, and federal partners to implement the work that we're doing. And it would not be possible without folks like you who are out on Minnesota lakes, recreating on Minnesota waters, and sharing excitement about loon conservation. So I would just like to extend a thank you from all of our community partners and for all of the work that you all are doing in learning more about loon conservation and being good loon stewards out on Minnesota lakes. So with that, I have some important information to share with you all regarding being loon aware on Minnesota lakes. So with a busy holiday weekend approaching, we'd like to just share a couple of quick reminders for you all when you're out on Minnesota lakes. And the first thing we ask is to be loon aware. So it's important to keep an eye out for loons on Minnesota lakes while you're recreating, whether that be in a pedal boat, a power boat, or even on a near shoreline area. Understanding different loon behaviors and some of this information will be extremely important. So I'll dive right into that. So the first thing that we encourage you to do is to view loons from a distance. And this can depend where you're at in the state on and understanding loon habitat, or not loon habitat, but understanding loon behaviors as well. Loons will exhibit several behaviors that can alert you as to showing signs of distress. One of those includes some of the calls that we heard earlier. You may remember the tremolo call and the yodel call. These are calls of distress, and loons may make these calls when approached too closely by humans. And so if you're out on a lake sometime this weekend or into the future, if you hear one of these calls, it's good to maybe paddle away or boat away a little bit quickly, just to eliminate any forms of additional distress that we may cause. And that ties in perfectly with listening for loons. Understanding those calls is extremely important in understanding how loons are feeling out on Minnesota lakes. And then we're also going to encourage you to watch what loons do when you're out on the lakes looking at loons. Some common forms of distress that loons may exhibit may be a raised eyebrow. If you notice a bump at the top of their head, this could be a sign of stress, which may mean you're a little too close. So I'd recommend, again, viewing loons from a greater distance at that time. You may also see some behaviors which include wing rowing. This is when loons will use their wings to move across the water. This is often a sign of distress. You may see this behavior when loons are interacting with other loons. But if you see this behavior while you're out on a Minnesota lake, it's good to also give them a little bit more space. We also have an interesting behavior called the penguin dance. This is where loons will kind of sit upright on the water and they'll be able to move upright. This penguin dance is an additional sign of distress, and we encourage you to please to back away a little bit from the loons to prevent any further distress. If you have any more questions about these behaviors, please let me know, and I can direct you to some resources that may show what those behaviors look like. When operating a watercraft, whether that be a fishing boat, a canoe, a wake boat, there's important things to consider with loons. So wave action from boats may flood shoreline nesting areas. And so when we think back about what the habitats that loons rely on for nesting, we would just like to draw attention that wave action can cause potential flooding in these areas. And so trying to eliminate any form of boat operation near shoreline areas is extremely important. But even in boats that may not be producing large wakes, such as fishing boats, canoes, or kayaks, if approached too quickly, loons may startle off a loon nest, and this could lead to loon nesting failure. So it's always good if you're kayaking or canoeing or fishing near shore to keep an eye out, be loon aware on these near shoreline areas to prevent any form of unknown disturbances that may come about. And also during this time of year, loon chicks are starting to hatch across the state. From June through the rest of the summer, loon chicks will start popping up across Minnesota. And so when operating personal watercraft or boats pulling wakeboarders, skiers, or even boats just driving quickly on Minnesota lakes, we're encouraging you to be loon aware, at some times these fast boats may run over loon chicks. So loon chicks are not able to dive when they're very young. And oftentimes when adults are with loon chicks, they may not dive as well. So it's always good to assume that, especially during this time of year, loons may have a chick nearby. And so we encourage you to slow down, give loons space, view loons from a distance, and to always be loon aware when you're out boating on Minnesota lakes. And so that kind of brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you all so much for joining me today to learn a little bit about common loons, the Minnesota Loon Restoration Project, and ways that you all can be loon aware on Minnesota lakes this summer. If you have any questions, my email address, mlrp.dnr@state.mn.us, is the best way to reach me. You can also visit our website listed here on this webpage. And so again, I'd like to say that this work is supported by funding from the Open Ocean Trustee Implementation Group through the Natural Resource Damage Assessment Deepwater Horizon Settlement. And unlike some other DNR programs, the non-game wildlife program is supported by community members and citizens of Minnesota through donations. And so I also just like to say to keep a lookout for a loon on your tax forms. And thank you from the non-game wildlife program, as your donations support work like this happening for loons and other non-game species here in the state of Minnesota. So thank you.
Wow, Jayden, that was very interesting, very informative. You're getting a lot of applause coming up the side of the screen. Heart, holy cow. Let's dive into the questions because there are a lot of them. And the first question is, has the increase in bald eagle populations impacted the population of eagles preying upon loon chicks?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a question that we get here a lot at DNR. And so research that we have available suggests that the bald eagle population and loon population, bald eagles are not having a population level effect on loons here in Minnesota. So it is very unfortunate to see, but eagles are natural predators of loons, and our research now indicates that eagles are not having a population level effect on loons here in the state. And so there are some ways that we're working to support the conservation work of loons here. As you may have seen in some of our photos that I included here in the presentation, our artificial nesting platforms often have avian guards, which will deter avian predators from impacting loons during the nesting time. But right now, there's very few conservation actions that we're able to take to limit bald eagle predation on loons. And so we're going to continue to keep a close eye on it, but at this time, not affecting the population.
Very good. So I think everybody's had plenty of time to jot down your email address there. So we'll shut down that screen, and that'll give everybody a larger view of us. Question number 2, what are the greatest predators from the water that snatch up baby loons after they're born?
Yeah, so we were just talking about eagles. Eagles are a primary predator for loons here in Minnesota. And so there are several other predators that loons have. That includes when there's small chicks on the water. This can include potentially a large snapping turtle or maybe even a large fish that may be looking as a predator of loons. And they also have a number of mammalian predators, especially at nest site locations, which can include raccoons or other mammals that occupy near shoreline areas. And some of this mammalian predation can also be increased with human presence. And so there are a number of predators that loons face, but loons are specially adept to face these predators. And so some of those calls that we talked about earlier, loons will signal those calls to let other loons know about a potential predator, such as an eagle flying overhead, to ensure that everyone on the lake, including every loon on the lake, is aware that there may be a potential predator. So loons are well adapted to face these different predators that they have.
So Laura has a follow-up question. I live on a small lake, 130 acres lake that does not have a lake association. We have one pair of loons that return each year. We made our own nesting platform, but would like help in securing a better platform. How do we do that?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I would encourage you to email us at mlrp.dnr@state.mn.us, and we can talk with you about some potential options that we have to support your interest in updating or securing a new platform. We might have some resources available for you.
Okay. Danielle said, if we were to come across a lone loon in distress in a location, season that it typically would not be in, should we notify anybody?
Yeah, if you have a concern about a potential loon in distress, we recommend that you contact your local licensed wildlife rehabilitator. And we have additional information on the DNR website about what to do with sick, injured, or orphaned wildlife. If you're not able to get a hold of someone, please do also contact your regional DNR office, and they may be able to help out with directing some additional resources there. But I always recommend contacting your local wildlife rehabilitator.
Okay. I think you covered this one in your presentation, but what problems did the artificial nest cause? How can someone find out if an artificial nest can be used on our lake?
Yeah, that's a great question. Some of those potential problems that loon face with artificial nesting platforms could be increased territorial disturbances, as loons are extremely territorial. Research suggests that this could cause increased disturbances, as well as nesting failure from an improperly constructed nesting platform may be a cause. In some instances, platforms may also attract additional predators. It's believed that platforms may attract some predators as well. So we have a scoring tool here at the DNR and with the Loon Restoration Project where we evaluate different factors on your lake to better understand whether a platform may be a good management tool to use. And so this typically takes a little bit of background understanding about the loons, about 5 years of history for loons on the lake, and then we'll run that through a scoring tool and provide further guidance for you.
Nice. Mary wants to know, how well do the artificial platforms work? Do you see loons returning to lakes that haven't had loons for years? What % of the platforms are used by loons each year?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of the work that we're doing right now as part of the Loon Restoration Project is looking to better understand the success of artificial loon nesting platforms in the state of Minnesota. It's also important to, as a management tool, these are often used on lakes that have loons that have historically had nesting failures. And so artificial nesting platforms typically do not bring loons to lakes where they have not been occupying that area. And so we specifically look to deploy these in locations where loons have had poor nesting success within the last 5 years, may have high levels of water fluctuation, high levels of avian or mammalian predation. And so we select those targeted locations to deploy artificial nesting platforms. And we do not recommend deploying them in locations that do not have loons or have not had loons for the past couple of years. And with that, again, it's very important that you contact your county sheriff's office to better understand the required permits that would be associated with the platform if you were interested in deploying one.
Okay. Jayden wants to know if will the state of Minnesota consider banning lead tackle, and are there efforts to do this?
Yeah, so the Minnesota DNR is partnering with our partners at the Minnesota Pollution Control Get the Lead Out program, and we're working on increasing the understanding of the impacts of lead fishing tackle on loons and more with our community partners. And so I'm a wildlife biologist, so legislation is a little bit outside of my scope, but if you have questions regarding more information about lead fishing tackle, I would recommend visiting our partners at the Pollution Control Agency Get the Lead Out program.
Okay. Cassie got a shout out. It says, Cassandra, what are the dimensions of the nesting platform? So maybe Jayden can tell us what they are, but.
Yeah, it kind of varies depending on the type of nesting platform that you use. And so if you have any questions, please let us know at our email address, and we'll work with you to find which platform may be the best for you. There's a couple of different models out there, so we'll work to better understand what might be best for your lake.
Okay. What's the long-term trend in Minnesota loon?
Yeah, so our long-term trend has been that our population has remained stable in the state of Minnesota. And recently, we've been starting to see small declines in juvenile loon productivity here in Minnesota. So it'll be important to continue to monitor our population into the future. But our historical monitoring data has suggested that the population has remained mostly stable. And I think that's really well representative of the great conservation work that Minnesota and Minnesotans from across the state have been implementing for many years.
Okay. Our next question is kind of poignant with tomorrow coming up. Do fireworks on lakes affect loons?
It can vary depending on the lake that you're at. Remember, it's always important to be loon aware. And if you hear some of those distress calls, it may be that the fireworks are causing a disturbance. We know very little about the impacts that fireworks might have on loons, and so I would just encourage you to be loon aware this upcoming weekend.
The DAS wants to know, is there an ideal maximum percentage of natural habitat for loons on a lake? Do you find that there is adequate, whatever that may be, natural habitat? There is no need for artificial nesting platforms.
Yeah, so in locations where ample natural shoreline areas exist, we typically do not recommend deploying artificial nesting platforms. Our goal is to have our natural shoreline areas for loons to nest on. This is a great long-term solution to support loon nesting and our population here in Minnesota. And so when there is enough natural shoreline areas present to support loon nesting, we don't recommend an artificial nesting platform. And this number can vary depending on the lake that you're in, the size of the lake, and the types of available natural shoreline areas that remain. And so that could include shallow bays, other things like that. So there's a lot that goes into it, which is why it's so important to address each question or situation on a case-by-case basis.
So this question from Laura says, what situations are loons most comfortable gathering in groups? We see groups of loons gather later in the summer.
Yeah, that's a really great observation, and something that is completely common to see in the fall. And so after loon nesting season in Minnesota, so towards September, October, you'll see these larger rafts of loons, is what we call them. A group of loons is a raft. And so when you see these large loons, they're often making their migration down to the Gulf of Mexico or southern Atlantic coast of the United States. And so at that time of year, a lot of the territorial behavior for loons goes away, and they become pretty social birds on their migration. So this is pretty common to see, especially on some of our larger lakes in Minnesota, these large rafts that of loons that are looking to get as much fish as they can before making the big trip to their non-breeding ground. So definitely an interesting observation, and always pretty interesting sight to see when we're so used to just seeing a couple on lakes. It's pretty cool to see in the fall.
Benita wants to know, she said, I've witnessed the opposite behavior where loons seem to be too friendly and want to get close to my boat or kayak. Any insight as to why?
Yeah, there's a couple of reasons that it could be. Some loons on lakes that have lots of people, they just may be more used to humans being on the lake, and so in most cases we encourage folks to reel in your line if a loon approaches you, and turn off your motor if you have one running to not cause any accidental injury. And then we just recommend waiting for the loon to kind of move on its own and not cause any disturbance if possible. So it is, in some cases, loons will approach you, and it's a pretty neat experience, but doing what we can to be loon aware and prevent any potential disturbances is really important when that does happen.
I was out fishing one time on a sunken island, and I hooked a small northern, and as we brought the fish close to the boat, this loon came from underneath the boat and just pecked that little fish. And it hung around right there waiting for us to let the fish go so they could go after it again, I think. Benita wants to know, she can't believe that they live up to 30 years. Can you confirm their lifespan?
Yeah, I believe I believe the oldest known loon is over 37 years old. And this is just because that's when we started researching how long do loons live. And so typically loons will live up to 20 years, but our oldest loons the oldest loons documented in the United States are older than 35 at least. So it's pretty amazing. These are very long-lived birds, which is why it's so important to all this conservation work that we're doing is so important, because they produce very few chicks per year and they live very long. And so doing what we can to support conservation is extremely important for these species.
Benita asked, is it one brood or batch a year, or if they lose their nest, do they re-nest?
Yeah, so if loons have a nest failure before hatching chicks, it is possible that they will have a re-nest. Sometimes loons will re-nest more than 3 times throughout a summer, but often it's very dependent on each pair of loons. Typically, once loons hatch 2 chicks, they will not nest again for that summer.
Okay. Benita loves the loon calls. Those were really neat. Faith wants to know, do you ever come to local farmers markets to talk about getting the lead out? I would love to see you in Shoreview, Arden Hills, Badness Heights, White Bear Lake area.
Yeah, that's a great idea. If you're interested in having a lead tackle collection event or having some additional information available for your community events, please do contact our partners at the Pollution Control Agency. They have a great information and resources on helping you set up that type of activity. So I would definitely recommend visiting their website and contacting them. I believe it's been posted in the chat.
So we've got about 7 minutes left and lots of questions. So we'll see what we can do here. Do you know off the top of your head if you are affiliated with the Snail Lake Association in Shoreview?
I'm not right off from what I can recall. So if you're interested, please do give us an email. It would be great to connect and talk about ways that we can help your association become more loon friendly.
Someone shared a link here. Animal Help Now is an app that people can use to find help for distressed animals. Thank you for sharing that. Karen, I'm in the Twin Cities. I don't boat or fish or live on a lake. What are some of the volunteer opportunities that could be a good match?
Yeah, I would recommend. I think there are still lots of opportunities for you to help out, whether that be through education and outreach. I would recommend giving us an email. It'll come in the chat in just a moment, and also contacting our partners at Get the Lead Out with the Pollution Control Agency. They may have some other opportunities for you as well. But there's still lots of ways to help.
So Cassie would like you to give the email address so she can post it in the chat.
Yes, I am providing that right
Great.
now.
Okay. How does one obtain a loon nesting sign at our lake and the public landings that we have? We have 2 families of loons on our lake.
Yeah, if you're interested in getting a loon nesting sign, I recommend calling your local DNR office and asking to speak with your area parks and trails supervisor. They will be able to approve deployment at those public boat launches. We're only able to post those at state-operated boat launches. If you have any more questions or need help finding those contacts, I can also provide assistance, and so you can send me an email as well.
Okay. What situations are loons most comfortable gathering? Oh, we talked about that one already. Is it fair to assume drought years are advantageous to loon nesting and offspring?
Not necessarily. It all kind of depends on what's happening during the loon nesting season. So during some cases of extreme drought, previous locations where loons have nested they may not be able to access those locations due to lower water levels. On the other side of things as well, during extreme rain events or high water levels, some of those natural nesting areas may be flooded as well. And so it really depends on what time of year it is, how far along loons are nesting, and so it can vary year to year. But typically, instances where there's extreme water level fluctuation, especially during May through June, can be difficult for loons as they nest on those near shoreline areas.
Okay. Mary was wondering if you could talk about the optimal density of shoreline vegetation and what type. Does the project work with partners to restore and maintain appropriate vegetation?
Yeah, we can connect you with folks who are doing shoreline restoration work across the state. The Minnesota DNR also has a Restore Your Shore website that has great information about shoreline restoration efforts. Again, it is really lake dependent on available emergent vegetation and submerged aquatic vegetation that all contributes to supporting a healthy lake ecosystem. But we do have some indicators and resources that we can help out with. So please do let us know if we can help out with that. And I also recommend contacting your local soil and water conservation district. They may have additional resources about ways that you can support shoreline restoration efforts or in general land management advice to support water quality in your area.
Benita shared that she had a loon swim under her kayak in the boundary waters. It was amazing to see, and they're huge.
Yeah, they are specially adapted to swim underwater. They spend almost all their time on water, so it's very unique to have those types of interactions and to see those experiences. It's pretty amazing. So thanks for sharing that. It's pretty cool to hear.
And our final question for today is what age do loons become sexually mature?
Yeah, typically once loons leave Minnesota lakes in the fall, they'll stay on the ocean for a couple of years, maybe 2 to 3 years, before returning back to the state. And so until then, loons will stay on the ocean, and when they're ready to come back to support nesting in the state of Minnesota, it'll be a couple of years before they return. So we're still continuing to learn more about what that might be. But there's previous research that indicates that it's a couple of years before they return back to Minnesota.
Okay, thank you so much. We got through all of our questions. I'd like to remind everybody that next week we'll be talking about southern Minnesota wildlife with both Region 3 and Region 4 wildlife managers. So that'll be a good show to tune into. And Jayden, thank you so much. It was very educational and entertaining today. Cassie, if you want to take us back to the green room, that would be awesome.